Hi everybody, thank you for joining me once again as I continue to work my way through Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, reading it, critiquing it from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover 3 more chapters from the book, chapters 35 through 37, and let's get started with chapter 35, which is titled Answering Skepticism, and appropriately enough, and also necessarily enough, given the tactic he's going to take to answer skepticism in this chapter, McDowell begins by defining what he means by skepticism. So this is Josh McDowell's definition of skepticism. Quote, "The belief that any reliable or absolute knowledge is impossible and any aspects of the supernatural are unattainable by any individual." So, right off the bat, we have a problem. Judging by this definition, it seems like McDowell is propping up a straw man to box with in this chapter. And indeed, that is exactly what he's doing. But upon reading the chapter for the first time as I was preparing this video, I was thinking, maybe I'm being too picky. Maybe this isn't what McDowell's doing. Maybe this is a perfectly reasonable definition of skepticism. It might not be how I see it, but maybe it's how other people see it. Because after all, it is sometimes very difficult to come up with a definition of a belief that will satisfy every single person that holds that belief. We have that same problem with defining atheism. Some people might say that atheism means believing that there is no God. Others may say that atheism means not believing that there is a God. The different ways of stating it are significant and are important to describing how people feel and how people define their own belief. Now, of course, most atheists presumably would agree that both of those definitions of atheism I just recited are better than McDowell's definition of atheism, which is believing you have absolute knowledge that there is no God. So let's see how McDowell's definition of skepticism compares to how that word is defined by more objective sources. And I apologize that this is going to take a few minutes, but this is my week to make points by being intentionally pedantic. So first let's see how the term skepticism is defined by Merriam-Webster. Here's Merriam-Webster's definition. 1. An attitude of doubt or a disposition to incredulity either in general or toward a particular object. 2a. The doctrine that true knowledge or knowledge in a particular area is uncertain. 2b. The method of suspended judgment, systematic doubt, or criticism characteristic of skeptics. 3. Doubt concerning basic religious principles as immortality, providence, and revelation. Again, that's from Merriam-Webster, taken from Merriam-Webster online. Now, that is not quite McDowell's definition. But then again, that's only one source. So let's see how Wiktionary defines skepticism. Here's what Wiktionary defines skepticism as. 1. The practice or philosophy of being a skeptic. 2. A studied attitude of questioning and doubt. 3. The doctrine that absolute knowledge is not possible. 4. A methodology that starts from a neutral standpoint and aims to acquire certainty through scientific or logical observation. 5. Doubt or disbelief of religious doctrines. Again, it doesn't sound like quite the same thing that Josh McDowell is talking about in his definition at the beginning of this chapter. But let's make sure and read one more definition. This one is from the Free Dictionary. Here's skepticism as defined by the Free Dictionary. 1. A doubting or questioning attitude or state of mind. Dubiety. 2. Philosophy. A. The ancient school of Pyrrho of Elis that stressed the uncertainty of our beliefs in order to oppose dogmatism. B. The doctrine that absolute knowledge is impossible, either in a particular domain or in general. C. A methodology based on an assumption of doubt with the aim of acquiring approximate or relative certainty. 3. Doubt or disbelief of religious tenets. What is the point of looking up the definition of skepticism 3 times? Well, the point is that, for one thing, it's not a difficult word to define, that there is general agreement on what it means, and that nobody, not the people who write dictionaries, not skeptics themselves, defines skepticism as the belief that reliable knowledge is impossible, or the belief that the supernatural is unattainable. Nobody other than apologists setting up straw man arguments defines skepticism in this way. Skepticism is not the denial of the possibility of reliable knowledge. It's not even necessarily the denial of the possibility of absolute knowledge, although practically speaking, most skeptics do accept that absolute knowledge about the world is impossible. And it's not the belief that the supernatural is unattainable, because that would presuppose the existence of the supernatural. And most skeptics don't believe in the supernatural because there isn't any evidence to compel them to believe in the supernatural. And skeptics don't believe in that for which there is no evidence, which is what makes them skeptics. Now then, McDowell summarizes the main tenets of skepticism as expressed by David Hume. And those tenets are: all knowledge is derived through either the senses or through reflection on ideas that are true by definition, for instance, mathematics, and causality cannot be observed but only believed based on custom. And to these pillars of skepticism, McDowell offers the following replies. First, McDowell says, skepticism is self-defeating. And to argue that skepticism is self-defeating, he quotes St. Augustine, who writes that someone who doubts is at least certain of the truth of the fact that he doubts, which means that in order to doubt truth, he has to believe in truth. By quoting St. Augustine here, McDowell at least demonstrates that he is innovating nothing by dishonestly redefining terms to suit his own arguments. To the contrary, he's actually carrying on a proud Christian tradition. Still making the argument that skepticism is self-defeating, McDowell quotes Gordon Clark, who defines skepticism as the position that nothing can be demonstrated, which is just as bad as McDowell's definition. And he also quotes our old pal Norman Geisler, who describes skepticism as an attempt to suspend all judgment about reality and discourage all attempts to discover the truth. There are a few things going on here, none of which reflects particularly well on McDowell and his quoted experts. First, as I mentioned previously in this series, a concept or a thing represented or referred to by a concept isn't automatically disproven just because you can define or describe it in a way that is circular or self-defeating. You can ask, should we be skeptical about skepticism? And you can pat yourself on the back for your cleverness, but you haven't refuted skepticism by making that self-defeating statement. To the contrary, most skeptics would probably say, yes, we should be skeptical about skepticism, in the same way that we're skeptical about other things. If it turns out that there is some better, more reliable method of approaching the world in an attempt to learn the truth, then I, as a skeptic, want to know about it. Although before I embrace this hypothetical superior method, I will need to see some evidence that it works better, because I am still a skeptic at this point, after all. Also, notice how the experts McDowell quotes have been forced, like McDowell himself in his opening definition, to distort the concept of skepticism into a kind of universal, permanent agnosticism in order to argue that it is self-defeating. Only people with beliefs threatened by skepticism seem to define skepticism in this way. Next, McDowell takes issue with the notion that all knowledge comes either from sensory experience or reflection on ideas. His issue is that he thinks the knowledge, that knowledge is derived from either the senses or reflection, comes from neither the senses nor reflection. And he quotes Ravi Zacharias on this subject, who says, quote, Hume's contention that in order to be meaningful, all statements should either be a relation to ideas, i.e. mathematical or quantity, or else should be of experimental reasoning based on questions of facts, is itself based neither on mathematical fact nor on experimentally established fact. Therefore, his very definition of a meaningful statement on his own terms is meaningless. Again, that's Ravi Zacharias from his book, Can Man Live Without God, quoted by Josh McDowell in Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Now, I have dealt with this in my series on I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Those of you who watched that series might remember when I was discussing Norman Geisler's claim to have refuted empiricism as a college student by arguing that the verification principle was excluded by itself, using an argument similar to the one Zacharias uses against Hume in that quote that I just read. Geisler's argument there failed for the same reason that Zacharias' argument fails here, and that reason is Hume's statement that propositions must be either derived from sensory experience or from reflections upon ideas in order to be meaningful is experimentally demonstrated. Notice that Zacharias doesn't tell us where Hume's proposition, which is the verification principle, practically speaking, does come from, if not from experience or reflection. I guess Hume just made it up, perhaps to support his baseless anti-supernatural bias, because you know we all have that. Now, I'm not David Hume, obviously, for those of you who are philosophy students and have watched my stuff, but I agreed with him on this before I even knew who he was, before I had ever read the verification principle or read any part of Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding. If there is another way of gaining knowledge about the world besides experience, I would genuinely like to hear it, because I can't think of how else I would ever know about it. You see what I did there? I have to experience it. Immanuel Kant conceived this as an analytic synthetic dichotomy. There is knowledge that is true by definition, and there is knowledge that is true because it is corresponding to reality. And that can only be known through experiencing reality. Now, I knew this was true before I had any familiarity with Kant either. How? Well, from my experience with the world, with reality. This is one of the wonderful things, I think, about philosophy. It can tell us what we already know, but with more elegance and clarity than most of us would ever have found on our own. Everything I have ever known is either true by definition or is derived from my experience. That's just how the world works. I know that through my experience with the world, there are no other ways of attaining knowledge about the world. It is an empirically derived principle. It's a conclusion I have come to based on my experience. It has been experimentally demonstrated to my satisfaction and well beyond. I don't know what the fuck Ravi Zacharias is talking about, and I wonder if he does. McDowell next turns his attention to Hume's ideas about causality. Quote, "The result of Hume's skepticism of causality would be that no events are connected." Well, that's only true if you selectively read the passage of Hume that McDowell himself quotes earlier in this chapter. And that passage would be, quote, "'Twould therefore be in vain for us to pretend to determine any single event or infer any cause or effect without the assistance of observation and experience." That's Hume writing in his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding about causality. Hume's point is that reason alone is insufficient for establishing causality. Hume doesn't deny that events have causes. He argues that you can't establish a certain cause and effect relationship between two events using reason alone. You need observation and experience. And he also points out that no matter how often you may experiment to determine the cause of a particular effect, a rock falling, for example, you can never be absolutely certain of the effect of a particular cause or the cause of a particular effect observed. You can only speak in terms of probability and not certainty. And this is similar to the problem of induction. No matter how many times you drop a ball and it falls, you can never be absolutely certain that when you drop the ball next time, it's going to fall. In conclusion to this chapter, McDowell again quotes that admired and influential philosopher Norman Geisler from his book, Introduction to Philosophy. Quote, "While skepticism is not defensible as an epistemological position, it is of value. It acts like a burr in the epistemologist's saddle, demanding that any claim to knowledge is based upon adequate evidence and is free from contradiction or absurdity. Again, that's Norman Geisler. That demand that claims be based on evidence and free from contradiction or absurdity is not merely a useful side effect of skepticism. That is skepticism. Skepticism, which Geisler asserts at the beginning of that quote, is not a defensible position. Yes, you heard me right. This man wrote a book titled Introduction to Philosophy. You can look for it on the library shelf right next to Introduction to Realism by Rene Magritte. Moving on to chapter 36, which is titled Answering Agnosticism. McDowell again opens the chapter with a definition of agnosticism, and this time it's a much better one than the one he tried to pass for skepticism. It is, quote, "The belief that man either does not know or cannot know. In theology, the theory is that man cannot attain knowledge of God." And from there, McDowell moves from Hume to Immanuel Kant in his examination of agnosticism. First, he summarizes Kant's philosophy, which McDowell claims results in hard agnosticism. Kant, McDowell tells us, argues that there is a distinction between the actual world and the apparent world, that is, what we perceive as the world through our senses, and that we can never know the thing itself, but only what our senses, as interpreted by our minds, tell us about the things that we are sensing. Well, to argue against Kant, McDowell again turns to the Aristotle of the modern age, Norman Geisler, who McDowell refers to at one point as Professor Geisler. I guess he's one of those few good, trustworthy college professors, who employs his trusty roadrunner tactic, which is apparently the only argument Norman Geisler knows, to declare that Kant's agnosticism is self-defeating. There's another one of those clever pat yourself on the back moments. Geisler says, quote, "The fundamental flaw in Kant's hard agnostic position is his claim to have knowledge of what he declares to be unknowable. In other words, if it were true that reality cannot be known, no one, including Kant, would know it. Kant's hard agnosticism boils down to the claim, I know that reality is unknowable." Kant's position boils down to this: statements about reality are only true if they correspond to reality. But the only way we can experience reality is through our senses, which are interpreted by our brains, which means we are never actually seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling reality itself, but impressions of reality created by our brains based on sensory input. Therefore, we can never be absolutely certain that our beliefs about reality, which are all necessarily based on those sensory experiences, are true. We can never be certain that the thing we sense actually is as we sense it. And that is agnostic. And it's also a fact, by the way. We are stuck at the mercy of our senses. There is nothing we can do about it, and it seems to me there is no point in trying to argue otherwise. It is simply the way our bodies work, and it is just the way we receive information from the world. But that doesn't mean that we've given up knowledge. We can know things about reality. We just can't know them for certain. That's one of the reasons why skepticism is so valuable and so necessary. The fact that we can't have certain knowledge means we have to check things out. We have to look for evidence. We have to look for confirmation so we can at least have reliable knowledge. Reliable knowledge is knowledge that has been tested, knowledge that has been shown to be consistent, shown to work when we act on it. And whether Josh McDowell or Norman Geisler or Ravi Zacharias or whoever else like it or not, it's the best we can do. And moving on finally to chapter 37, Answering Mysticism. Another chapter, another definition. Mysticism, says McDowell, is, quote, "the belief that direct knowledge of God, of spiritual truth or ultimate reality is attainable through immediate intuition or insight, the subjective, and in a way different from ordinary sense perception or the use of logical reasoning. And that is actually a pretty good definition, probably because Norman Anderson, who is the author that McDowell quotes for that, was himself quoting Webster's dictionary for that definition, which makes me wonder why, since Anderson himself offers no unique insight into the subject in that quote, McDowell didn't cut out the middleman and simply quote that dictionary definition himself. The mind of an apologist. The particular form of mysticism that McDowell addresses in this chapter is Zen Buddhism, as described by D.T. Suzuki. Of the three philosophies examined in these chapters that I've discussed in this video, Skepticism, Agnosticism, and now Mysticism, I would bet that mysticism is by far the least commonly held among critics of Christianity, serious critics of Christianity. So, of course, the chapter devoted to refuting mysticism is twice as long as either of those previous two chapters. Now, I am not a Zen Buddhist. I am not a mystic. I have no desire to defend the ideas of D.T. Suzuki as presented by McDowell in this chapter, although I do think Suzuki would be much more interesting to have a conversation with than Josh McDowell. But some of those ideas of Zen Buddhists are that there are two types of knowledge. There is knowable and there is unknowable knowledge, and unknowable knowledge must be intuited or derived from inner insight rather than learned through experience. That reality is illusory, that our reality is all sort of a mirage, is not the real reality, and that mystical experiences are beyond description or expression. I don't believe there are such things as truly mystical experiences to begin with, nor do I accept that there is mystical, unknowable knowledge which represents some truer, more ineffable reality than the one that we can sense. Nevertheless, there are some things about the way McDowell chooses to respond to Suzuki's Zen teachings that strike me as a little hypocritical. For a start, there is McDowell's complaint that Suzuki defines Zen in such a way as to render it immune from criticism. McDowell says, quote, "Suzuki says that Zen is self-authenticating and not at all concerned about criticism of its contradictions." Does that sound like anyone else we know? McDowell doesn't outwardly present Christianity as above criticism. But if you follow his arguments all the way down, that is essentially what he is saying. Things are true because the Bible says they're true. The Bible is perfect and free from contradiction, and if you find a contradiction that can't be harmonized away, you can always appeal to the perfect, conveniently non-existent, totally unfalsifiable original autographs. If he's always got that in his back pocket, how is his version of Christianity not just as above criticism as Suzuki's Zen philosophy? And by the way, if it's all based on the authority of the Bible, how is it not just as self-authenticating? The only difference is McDowell doesn't openly present it as such. But here's the one that really makes me laugh. McDowell takes issue with Suzuki's assertion that there are two types of knowledge, knowable and unknowable, that describe two different levels of reality. McDowell quotes David Clarke and, wait for it, Norman Geisler from their book Apologetics in the New Age, where they object to the mystics positing this higher realm of experience that is superior to the physical, empirically knowable world we live in, one from which the higher ultimate truth is derived. They argue that even that higher realm, which mystics claim transcends rationality, requires us to draw a logical distinction between it and the empirical world in order to meaningfully define it, which means even knowledge of it in all its reason-shattering transcendence is ultimately dependent upon logic and empiricism. Wow. Could you write a better refutation of Christian mysticism than that? The thing is, Christian apologists don't call their thing mysticism, they call it divine, they call it revelation, but essentially what they believe is that there is another realm from the one we experience every day, a higher realm that is the ultimate reality containing the ultimate truth, a reality and a truth that transcends the physical and logical rules of our world. And furthermore, they believe we can experience this reality, or at least communicate with it, receive knowledge from it, via a process that bypasses our senses. How can you listen to Christians describing hearing God speak to them, feeling moved by the Holy Spirit, feeling as though they've received a word from the Lord, without concluding that this was a mystical experience? Or would have been anyway, if it were real and not the product of a delusion. And if McDowell and Clark and Geisler, who is inexplicably the author's go-to authority for this shit, are right about the mystical experiences of a Zen Buddhist being ultimately rooted in the empirical and therefore subject to the same rules of logic and evidence as everything else, and I think they are, then the same must hold true for their own religious beliefs. In I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Norman Geisler crowed about refuting empiricism. So how fitting then that he relies on it to refute mysticism, and in the process unwittingly refutes his own religion as well. So that's where Josh McDowell picked up the habit. Well, that is it for this round. I will be back in the next and final video in this series to conclude this book by looking at the final 3 chapters. Chapter 38, Certainty versus Certitude. Chapter 39, Defending Miracles. And Chapter 40 is History Knowable. And I'll also talk about some of the concluding material in the book. And I'll have a few concluding remarks of my own to try to sum up this whole experience of reading and analyzing evidence that demands a verdict. So that's it. Next episode is the last one in the series. We're coming into the home stretch, folks. So hang with me, okay? We're almost done. Thank you as always for watching. I look forward to reading what you have to say about this. Please feel free to comment on anything you've heard me say. I really appreciate your interest. I appreciate that this has been of use to a lot of you. I'm glad to hear from you when you tell me things like it's helped you have more clarity with your own ideas or think up your own arguments against Christian arguments or apologetic arguments, etc. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, and I'm really grateful that you guys have found some use from it. So we'll be back in the next episode to finish it all up. I will see you then.